All right. Well, thank you, everyone. My name is Yatsu. I'm chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands, and I'm here to discuss basically the importance of our metaverse future. And you've already had a whole set of panels and discussions for the day that discussed all the amazing things that NFTs in the metaverse can do. So this will be hopefully some food for thought as to what it all means. Very quickly, Animoca Brands is a company that has been really building in the space for the last actually over 4 years at this point. We have done over 150 investments in the space, including companies like Axie Infinity and OpenSea, Dapper Labs, Wax, Decentraland, and a whole range of companies. And what we've also done is we've helped build up projects like the Sandbox and Rev Racing and Tower and so on. And you can learn more about us if you check us out on Twitter, on Animoca Brands. But let's talk about the subject at hand. And I'm sure you've heard it many times today. What is the metaverse? Lots of things talking about it. And I think we have, to some degree, we should thank Mark Zuckerberg for putting the term metaverse into everyone's lips. And perhaps even just a few days ago, with the $69 billion purchase of Activision by Microsoft, where Satya Nadella was specifically talking about, that this is part of their metaverse strategy. But where did it all begin, really? And actually, the journey for many of us early people in the metaverse stage actually really started 40 years or maybe even longer ago, with the advent of some of the early computers. And that little green telephone that you see there connected is an acoustic coupler. And what that did actually was the beginning of a device that connected people from all over the world, basically together. And I wanted to share this little sort of advertising. So I grew up with this, and my first access to the pre-metaverse experience was in fact CompuServe. And you can see here where they talk about how, this was in the 80s, how you could be a virtual travel agent, a stock analyst, or how it could be sending Herbie to another galaxy. And what's interesting, of course, 40 years later, is that, of course, CompuServe was only text-based at the time. But today, we do this every day, actually, when you think about it. We're sending little Herbies all over little galaxies in the form of video games, or other forms of imagination, or other forms of thought, basically, in an early form of the metaverse where we are today. So with 3.2 billion gamers in the world today, 4.6 billion people online, we could say that really where we are today has been a grooming for the last 4 decades, preparing us for this moment that perhaps we didn't know looking back, but we are now ready to enter the true metaverse. We spend most of our time already online, even though we don't necessarily think that we might be living virtually. Actually, perhaps our virtual life is perhaps more important, even not for people just in our industry, but everyone. First thing you do, probably look at your device. How do you communicate with your friends? How do you make contact? How do you conduct business? Everything is actually done through this virtual device, through a form of an interface. So what is the true metaverse? First, let's talk about some base principles, and then we talk about how this can really impact the future. The most important resource of the metaverse, as we all know, is data. And in fact, data today has become the world's most valuable resource. If you look at the biggest companies in the world, they're all data-rich companies. That data is something that actually is different here because unlike the past, where resources were things that we would mine from the ground of the property that we owned, like oil, for instance, or other natural resources, this particular resource comes from our mind. It comes from our headspace. In other words, we ourselves are the creators of that data, which means we are the creators of our own resource. But one of the issues we have today is that in old days, when we would labor on our land and our property, we owned that property, or we owned the tools that generated the fruits of that labor. But the world we live in today, and particularly as we move more digitally, actually capital owns the machines that derive value from the labor. And in fact, we ourselves no longer have property in any of that. And this is perhaps best illustrated when you take a look at, for instance, who owns the network effect when we use something like Facebook, or when we play a game, or when we actually do anything online today. We think that our time online is, valuable in the sense that we're making connections. But in fact, most of the value is harvested by the platform because now they have the ability to take our data and basically refine it into the most awesome network effect at 1 billion users a second. Now, this is a little bit like finding oil 1,000 years ago, because if we found oil in the ground, we would not know what to do with it, and it was not valuable. That is how we treat data still today for most of us. Because if we download our photos or images and we download our data, we don't know what to do with it. It is only valuable inside those machines. But who owns those machines and who owns the output of that? And that is the issue that we have to face with a kind of metaverse that we need to make sure that is not owned by just the data platforms of today. Because where we're living today is a kind of digital imperialism. And we live in an age where we are basically colonized. Our data is the free resource that powers all of them. If we all stop using Facebook, if we all stop playing these free-to-play games, how valuable, in fact, are these platforms? They're not valuable at all. So their legitimacy, their power, actually stems entirely from the usage and the users, which is us. And yet we don't get even a share of any of that. So that's the issue, though, that we have to face. And it is a very urgent one, because it is a major contributor to rising wealth inequality, because there is a world that we can see perhaps illustrated in other ways where those who know how to manipulate the data, or those who have the opportunity to work for the companies that own that data, are obviously doing well. And for all of others who are in other forms of labor or other forms of work are actually going to continue to have less value and become basically less important. This is the paradigm where we are so hopeful about basically NFTs and the metaverse. Because for now, what it means is that NFTs actually become the mechanism in which we can own a property. Because as I said earlier, the data that is produced, like an artist, when he makes a painting, it's in fact his ideas, it's his data. That is actually a digital property. That digital property can now actually be turned into the metaverse as your asset, which you can freely compose on and do other things. Our idea space basically belongs to ourselves. And we can now compose new experiences on top, which will create added value in the same way that human innovation has always added value on top of the ownership of others. Let me illustrate this in the format of cars, a favorite example of ours. But what we're really saying here is that ownership is a platform of growth. Ownership is, in fact, the platform of everything. Property rights is the reason that we can develop industries and societies the way that we see today. And in the digital world, we don't actually own any of it. That's why the platform of growth belongs to the platform itself and not to the individuals. But let's take a look at this example with cars. Cars in itself, the invention of the car 100 years ago, actually more than 120, 30 years ago, actually wasn't thought of as a platform, as a utility, the horseless carriage to take from point A to point B. But in fact, what the car has become is the private decentralized ownership of millions of people in the world that have cars has led to businesses like Uber or Lyft or gas stations, car wash companies, interior sort of designers for cars, people who have drivers, baby seat manufacturers, and actually an industry that is far, far greater and have provided far more employment than the manufacturing and sales of car itself. In other words, private ownership, decentralized private ownership, is the engine for growth in everything we do. The fact that I can own a house is the reason we can have IKEA, interior decorators, brokerage agents, mortgaging and banking facilities. Because if I don't own property, no bank will lend you. It's a little bit like thinking of, if I rent something, I won't invest as much in my home knowing that I will leave. But if I own my house, then I will invest in it because I think of it as a long-term future. And in the past, content was only consumable because it could not be turned into an asset. But with the paradigm of what we see with the metaverse and non-fungible tokens, all content creators, all artists are now asset creators, which means all of us and all of you have the potential to become your own platforms through the decentralized private ownership of all of your community and your customers. The digital experience on this means that, of course, one popular example is that you could create a virtual sword. A little bit like what people do with the PFP projects you see today. And they could be used in one game, they could be used in another game, or they could be used for lending, or they could be used in many, many different ways, and essentially enhance and create an added network effect. When you think about the power of the car, I gave you an example, all these other services actually didn't just add value to the users that are using the car, it added value to the company that's making the car. The car has more utility now. It can be used in better ways. The fact that I own an iPhone can go allow me have a cassette business or headphone business or other things on top of it. So, and the more utility and the more connections there are, the deeper the network effect, and therefore more value is generated. And that's basically the powerful thing about ownership economics as we move from rental to ownership. I won't go into many examples because you've already seen this today, probably during the course of the last couple of days. But of course, one of the famous examples of one of our portfolios, Axie Infinity, where the future of work, where people are spending time playing games and essentially making money from it, or in Rev, or even with Sandbox, for instance. And what's interesting about this is that from one hand, you could say, why are people making money in a game where time is spent free? But as I explained earlier, nothing is really free. When we spend time playing any one of our games today, we are contributing to the network effect. We are making the game valuable through our time. Because if we all stop playing the game, there's nobody to play against or with, and therefore other people won't pay for it. So there is a network effect. What the value is dependent on the strength of that network effect. But that value is now being fairly distributed in play to earn, for instance, into other people's time. In the same way that if we use Facebook, actually we ought to be paid for time. The other potential, of course, is that we now can have the fair value for our culture and our creativity because we can now own a stake. And I won't delve to go too much into this because the panels earlier have already discussed this in great detail. But it is a way where the culture that we have created now has a tangible value, in whatever form that we can now monetize if we want to. But most importantly, we own the property. And like in earlier examples I gave, that property can develop on top of the work of others, or others can enhance it any which way they like. And it's more accessible than things like open source because we don't need to know how to code. And other thing I would also add is that, our value in the physical world has always really been virtual. Although I would say that Bored Apes probably have flipped in terms of value of a Birkin bag. When you buy a Birkin bag, or you buy a Rolex, or even you buy even a Ferrari, what are you actually buying? It is not the materials in and of itself necessarily. Most of the value that you're purchasing, perhaps even 99% of it, is entirely based on the creative storytelling, the background, the network effect of who else owns it or who else uses it. So if you think of it this way, then actually virtual items and virtual fashion and virtual goods are simply an extension of what we already define as value. And where that ends up really is that really this becomes a world in which all of our content becomes assets and we can have social identification with it, as you've heard already some previous panels talk about that, at scale, ones that we can create. Now, what does that really mean for us in the future? All of these things that, we're still at the early stages in what has to be in an open metaverse because it can't be in a closed environment. And I want to sort of share this little thing here just as we close. It's called the Imaginative Thinking Test. George Land and Beth Jarman created this test, actually really originally for NASA scientists, as a way to determine whether whether engineers that joined NASA, were going to be divergent enough, meaning creative enough to solve problems. Because when you send someone to the moon and there's a problem, it's never been done before. So you have to make sure you have an engineering group of people that know exactly how to solve it. So they took that test that they designed for NASA and actually ran it on children. And they ran it on children and followed them until the age of 15 and did the same test for adults, which became most of the body of work of famous scholars like the late Sir Ken Robinson. And they found that children at the age of 5 were able to solve all problems divergently, meaning creatively, with imagination, 98% of the time. And by the time they basically went to school, it dropped to 30% being able to solve a problem creatively. And by the time they actually became high schoolers and teenagers, it dropped to 12%. And the adults, well, people like us, we only scored 2%, right? So by the time we went to work, by the time we graduated after university, our creative capacity was only 2%. Now, when you measure that against the world, how many people are entrepreneurs? How many people are change makers? How many people are doing sort of creative things that are different? Actually, it's probably true, only a very small percentage. But really, what this says about us and about humans is actually not that we are made to be creative, that in fact, creativity is within us. That as humans, our creative capital is perhaps the most valuable and powerful thing that we have. And in the context of the metaverse, that is all that what that is, meaning that actually we are the creators of our own creative capital. And if we rejig our thinking, our children will be growing up in an age where it is all about creativity and divergent thinking and can be truly celebrated because we're living in an education system that was designed for an industrial age, not celebrating and requiring where the metaverse is going. So in other words, we have the capacity, every one of us, to be our own creators of our own equity. And we are creative by birth, and we should continue to foster that, and it is not too late. What the metaverse and technology does is enable and liberate that thinking. I like to use this example of a calculator because I grew up in a time, basically in the 70s and 80s, where I was not allowed to use a calculator. And maybe some of us in the audience will also appreciate that because using a calculator was considered cheating. But of course, today, every student, even in tests, gets to use a calculator because we recognize that the calculator basically does the job of a basic machine far better than we as humans. And really what it's done is it's liberated our thinking to be more creative in the very simplest of cases. Now, as we advance that with computers, we go back to where little Herbie goes and all of our little children, and in fact, traveling to other galaxies and being creative. That is, in fact, this future with the metaverse, where we use the technology and the offering, the property rights that NFTs give us, to give us potential in the future of all of that. And I would say also that we don't have to look too far into the future to know where the future is going, because all you have to really do is observe basically your environment and what's happening now. The paradigm here is that when you think about labor, machines are going to do a lot of things already. And in fact, we don't need drivers. We don't really need people in manufacturing. We don't need many things that used to be scarce in the physical context. So for humanity as well, what can we do that machines cannot? And that is about creativity, empathy, feelings, those type of things that ultimately, what is the metaverse all about? What is it about owning our creative capital? It is really, for humanity. But the most important thing here is that it has to stay in an open environment because, we ought to own the fruits of our labor and not the platform. And in the closed metaverses that are being built today, they're, by many of the largest companies out there, they own the fruits of our labor, and we are not being paid a fair wage for that. And so building on blockchain in the metaverse is the way in which we can solve that. I'll close with this. It's a little bit old, but I thought it was something useful to consider. This is from my primary school, my kids. This is some years ago, and maybe 10 years ago. And there was a QR code on the screen, an old technology as we know today, though we do use it a fair bit still. And none of the parents knew what a QR code was. And so the children in the class helped them how to do it. And it shows something interesting here, which is when you think also in other contexts, when you are actually experiencing early forms of the metaverse, when you're playing video games, in fact, our children are far, far better than us. Try to win a game with your kids. You probably won't fare too well. So this is their future. We don't have to look too far to the future. We just have to look to our children to know where it's going, to know what they want to do, to know what they want to get for Christmas, for instance. That tells us where the metaverse is, and it's for them. Thank you.